Thank you for the introduction. Yes, that was me. I am a veterinarian, boarded nutritionist in small animals, and that's been since I worked at UC Davis. I did my residency there, and now in France, working with Royal Canin in the corporate affairs team. So we'll get started. I will, if you have any questions, I can't see my screen. I'll put my screen up. It will go into presenter mode, so I won't be able to see chats and so forth. But if there are questions, hopefully we'll get to those. And if not in this session, I hope that we could do it at another time, or I can answer those via email. So let's go through this, and I'll just put my screen up. So yes, we'll go through raw diets, we'll go through the pros and cons, and then also the zoonotic risk that it pertains. So just to start off with, this is a really common question. I'm sure you will receive this in your careers as well. What should I feed my pet? Which can come from families, friends, clients. And it's not an easy question because there's a lot that is required to answer that question. It's not just a simple dry or canned food or what brand per se. There's a lot of thought that goes behind it. And especially as a nutritionist, there is a lot more than just feeding kibble. This is just some history in the background when first kibbles were produced. So that was in 1956 when Purina produced the first.
Lara.
Yes?
Hello. I'm so sorry, but we can't actually see your screen.
It's decided to stop. No, it's saying it's sharing. I will unshare and reshare. Is that sharing now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
We can see it now. Thank you.
Awesome. No, pleasure. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened there. So again, just moving through just quickly, extruded kibble that first was presented on the markets by Purina dog chow. The first treats were back in like 1860, and then you also had canned food, which came in 1922. So there's a long history of commercialized pet food products. But as I said, it's not just commercialized products to be able to answer that question. You can have home-cooked diets now. Even when you talk about commercial food, you have to think about, is it therapeutic? Is it treating a disease? Has it got a drug component to it? Or is it just a premium brand? Or is it found in the general supermarket and accessible? And where it's actually accessed by the owners can define what is available. We also have the definitions of organic, natural versus human grade, and that list does continue if you look at the FEDIF and AFCO guides on the actual definitions. So, and then we come to more and more often about raw versus cooked, the pros and cons here and what that looks like, and if it's semi-cooked, if it's fresh frozen. Again, that list does go on as well. And then, as I mentioned, canned, but also then canned breaks down into, like, is it semi-moist or is it actually a dry product? And then more recently, as you come through with the trends of human-grade food or human, how our diets are influencing what we feed our pets, you can think about vegan, vegetarian, the sustainability factor, and then grain and no grain, which is also then the myth busters of, how grain affects our patients and affects maybe potentially their skin or food allergies. So it's really not a simple question to answer what to feed, but we'll look at the raw and versus cooked today. We won't go into all the other pros and cons. But every diet does have an advantage and a disadvantage. So when we think about dry food, definitely it's when we do it in clinics, it's very economical. It's very easy to give. It's a quick and convenient option for owners. You can leave it down all day if you needed to for some patients. Otherwise, you can meal feed that and you can measure that out quite easily. It has a long shelf life, depending on how it's packaged and which company, but overall it has a long shelf life, and depending on where you buy it from, it can actually be quite economical if it's just a supermarket brand and not a veterinary therapeutic diet. But again, with the dry, there comes some disadvantages and the concerns that obviously it has to go through high heat production, which will affect nutrient availability. And for some patients, in particular, maybe cats that can have favoured certain types of food or develop aversions to certain food, it can affect whether you can actually feed dry to your patients. Semi-moist is great. It's palatable, single servings. They tend to come in pouches. The odour can be more powerful, so it might be helpful for cats or senior cats. Various shapes, various colours, so it can actually be quite even appealing to the owners, so they feel like they're giving a human food grade type meal. Also, long shelf life. Canning processes have high heat productions, and so they can also last on the shelf a lot longer than, let's say, raw food. And it could be more appealing in texture based on palatability. But disadvantage is you wouldn't leave that out. It will dry out, and it is quite expensive, especially for large breed animals, because it tends to be in small pouches, so it's not ideally an option. It might actually be more of a topper. And canned food, high moisture content, which is excellent for certain disease conditions, let's say urinary, or for cats that tend not to drink just naturally. It is also exceptionally convenient. Open a can, put it down, and a meal is served. As I mentioned, long shelf life, can be highly palatable because typically these are higher in fat than dry food, but disadvantage if you feed high fat. There's a higher risk of obesity. Palatability does depend. Yeah. It can be palatable. Yes.
Boleh? Enggak.
I think someone's microphone might be on. Cost. So cost can be expensive as well, like the single serves, and especially for large breed patients. This is maybe not the most economical in comparison to dry. And then there's just preferences that animals may not eat this. And so when we look at raw-based meat diets, what does that actually entail and what does that mean? So the definition that comes from Lisa Freeman, I would recommend to read this, Timely Topics in Nutrition. It's a little bit older, but it gives a really good round view on the knowledge that we have about raw meat-based diets, or RMBD, for both dogs and cats. So if we look at the definition, we have that of uncooked ingredients. They can be domesticated or wild-caught food from different animal species. And it can also, it includes not just the skeletal muscle, but its internal organs. It can include bones. And one important point here too, it does include unpasteurized milk and uncooked eggs. And I know some breeders may actually, or not just breeders, owners as well, do just put eggs on top of their patient's diet. And so that is also considered a raw diet there. So in that, why people want to feed this and the advantages and disadvantages we'll go through, but to understand that it's also important to know the different types that are available and where they've come from. So you have commercially available, and they look at, these are called fresh, frozen or freeze-dried. You can have home-prepared diets, and these tend to be things that the recipes come from books, they've come from, they might come from the internet, breeders, they may even come from veterinarians themselves, like this Ultimate Diet, or BARF, which is Bones and Raw Food Diet. Well, technically BARF is called Biologically Appropriate Raw Food. And that was, I think, if I'm correct, started out in Australia, and that's just, that's the concept of feeding bones and to reflect the biological past ancestry behaviour of dogs and cats. The other diet you might see is raw meaty bones, feeding that alone. Or you might see mixtures that are considered raw-based diets. And so I think that's just been cut off. Sorry about that. It's raw meat, but that's been, they're going to have additives or certain supplements that are added to the raw meat, and they come in as mixtures. So something like Instinct or Nature's Raw is another one, another brand that you might see depending on where you are in the world. And reasons why, so saying for this to understand why people want to, and not just with raw food, I think as a nutritionist it's important to understand the goals and the motivations of why an owner wants to feed a particular type of diet, whether that be commercialised, whether it's canned food. You really need to select your owners to the type of diet you want to feed. And so if an owner does come to you and say that they want to feed raw, you need to it would be helpful to understand why, so that you can tailor, at least then when you give your answer as to why or why not to feed raw, you can match their needs. So in a study that was done for the motivations, I think it was done in, I didn't put the date on that one, sorry about that. I feel like it was done in 2013 or 17. For dogs, the main reason that raw is popular is because owners feel that, or they had said in this study, that they felt that it was healthier. That was the main reason. And this is, it doesn't say exactly if it's comparison to commercial food. 70% said it was a more natural approach. And then there's the skin and coat reasons, that it would improve the skin and coat, or they noticed once they switched from the old diet to the raw diet that the skin and coat improved from them. They were concerned about commercial pet food, and this is quite a common complaint or concern that you'll hear often, is there's safety issues. Again, there might be nutrient value issues if it's lost, the high heat the extruded kibbles have to go through, and also concern for quality. There could be the measures, there could be even antibiotics that might be supplemented, or concerns that there's additional supplements, or the preservatives are not natural. So there are some reasons then. Other ones were for the dental and oral hygiene, especially if you're feeding bones, it cleans the teeth. And then there's the immune system and palatability were other reasons why they changed over or left commercial pet food products. For cats, it's a little bit different as to why they're feeding raw food. 80% had said that they were informed by non-veterinary resources that it was the better alternative. The other 70% said that they didn't want just to feed processed food. That was similar, I guess, that would be concerns about the commercial pet food. 70%, like dogs, said there was an increase, improved immune system. It supports the immune system. 60% were recommended by the veterinarians to move over to a raw diet, and otherwise they might find it on a website, better advice there, or family and friends, which I'm sure all of us have heard down in the dog park, or down, locally at the cafe with your pet, that, they've started feeding a certain diet, and therefore recommendations come from there. Advice comes from just casual conversations, but no evidence actually behind that. And so this is where we're going into the pros and cons of why you want to feed a raw diet. So there's these potential health benefits that have been claimed with feeding raw diet, and potentially there is higher digestibility and therefore lower fecal output. And so these are some studies that you can actually refer to that have been in 2018 and one a little bit older in 2012, and the effects of digestibility in the macronutrient profile, and looking at the overall total tract digestibility. However, when we're looking at the digestibility versus all the other claims that have come through, that might be, the shiny coat, or there's increased longevity, or we said there's increased immune support. What we don't have available to this point in the literature is to say we have facts, and we don't have the literature to say that that is proven. So at the moment, there is some studies on digestibility associated with raw feeding, but when it comes to shiny coat, the teeth benefits, and all the other mentioned associated qualities of raw diet, it's only anecdotal. We don't have the scientific evidence, and we don't have the long-term studies to be able to say that a commercial diet, or that even one type of feeding, is superior over another. And I think that's really important to highlight if you're scientists, and if we're going to be make decisions based on the literature, we can confidently say that we just don't, at this point in time, raw feeding is anecdotal. So you may hear down it, from other recommended sources to feed raw, but in the literature, we don't have that. And going back to trying to understand then why are people feeding raw, like where it is becoming very popular, and you will hear that the evolutionary desire to reflect their wild ancestors. So especially for cats, and for, you know, they're looking at the wild cat that's in them. They're out the hunters. There's the hunting instinct. For the dogs, it's more reflective of the wolf. And that they're naturally going to be eating this, and so therefore their DNA, their natural way to process nutrients would be similar to that as if they were in the wild. However, we know that dogs are not wolves, and I'm not going through the literature to go through this, and same with the cats as well. But they're definitely there's enough DNA that they are similar, but there's a great separation between them, and how they are physically, how their behaviour is, how they're breeding, how they're hunting is separate to the dog and wolf are definitely not the same. Same with the cats as well, and the large cats. You also don't see your kitten or format or your older cat, senior cat, out in the wild hunting down a cow or hunting its prey. So it's really unlikely. They wouldn't survive as long out in the wild in comparison to the lives that we are actually giving them in our homes. So that's important to remember that and remind owners that as well. And the wild is harsh. They wouldn't live long lives out in the wild. So, from diseases to fractured, to fighting, to fractured infected teeth, the wild is very harsh in comparison to our lovely warm homes and well-fed pets. So we can't really give them that same diet. And examples here, as I'm just giving, this is very top line. I won't go through the literature here, but physically dogs are not the same. If you're looking at all the different shapes and sizes of dogs, with from the Great Dane to the Chihuahua as a prime example, the teeth, the size, the skull are all different, and it's different to that of the wolf as well. How they're chewing and how they're shearing their meat in comparison to the molars of a canine. The behaviour, dogs are scavengers. How dogs became domesticated were around garbage bins. They moved closer and closer into human habitats and were just scavenging off the scraps. They were not hunting. They were not hunting together like wolves. So there's no dependence and there's no attachment to humans as well, as the dog would in comparison to the wolf. If we think about the breeding, the wolf pups mature a lot quicker. They leave their mother a lot quicker and quite independent early in comparison to that of dogs. There's smaller litters, and dogs also breed more regularly throughout the year in comparison to that of a wolf. And then hunting, as I said it just before, I won't go through that again. And the biggest thing as well is that dogs are omnivores. They're not sole carnivores. The meat, they don't just survive on meat. And also wolves, majority would gain their vegetable, or like their greens, when they're eating the intestines. But other than that, it's not a great proportion of their diet. So that's really important to remember. Biggest things for concerns when we talk about raw. So it's the nutritional adequacy. And as nutritionist, and working in a nutrition company, that's going to be a priority. When we're looking at deficiencies and excesses, we know even just from home-cooked diets as well, whether it's cooked or not, nutritional adequacy is balancing a diet and making it complete and balanced for a particular life stage is really difficult. Working as a resident, we did that all the time, home-cooked diets, and it takes a long time to be able to make sure all those nutrients, I'll give you an example here, these are all the essential nutrients of a dog and cat listed on the left-hand side, from proteins to vitamins to minerals, macrominerals, microminerals, the EPA, DHA, and trying to get that to the green and meet the requirements, minimum requirements, and staying under toxic levels as well is really challenging. So to feed raw, it's highly unlikely that it's going to be nutritionally balanced if it's just a meat diet. If you've learnt in your studies when it's an all-meat diet, you're going to have a prime example is a calcium deficiency or calcium to phosphorus imbalance, probably higher calcium and lower in phosphorus, and they can lead to metabolic bone disorders. Other things, when you're feeding high fat all meat diets, you probably have a high fat content that can lead to obesity, but for dogs, you'd be thinking about pancreatitis as well. And there's enough literature to say, and this is just one, I could go through many, many more, but a good example here is that there's a high percentage of home-cooked diets, not even cooked, or just home-prepared diets, I should say, that have inadequate amounts of nutrients to meet the nutritional requirements of dogs and cats. So the example on the left-hand side with the table, or the greens and reds, are just a typical example of how hard it is to make a diet balanced. And not all the time. The other thing, you don't always want all the nutrients to be on that green meat's requirements, because there are disease processes that you may not want. Let's say kidney disease, you may not want the calcium or the phosphorus to be too high if they're hypercalcemic, or if they're let's say pancreatitis as well, you may not want the fat to be within the green, the total fat requirement. So we need to be aware that it's very, very tailor made to be complete and balanced. Another aspect about nutritional adequacy, as I just said, you'll see in the literature here, is that when you're feeding all meat, you run into complications with calcium, mineral imbalances, and also vitamin D imbalance. And rickets have been reported. You can have up to 60% of recipes being inadequate, and particularly when it comes to growing animals. It's very difficult, and they need to be monitored closely to ensure the animal needs to be monitored, but to make sure that you're constantly meeting their requirements as they continue to grow. And they're just at a higher risk. It's a very delicate stage of growth. And as an example here, so the all meat diets is excessive in phosphorus, quite often deficient in calcium. And an example here with these x-rays is there's osteopenia, and there's a left tibial fracture. And that can be, this was a kitten that was a 5-month-old Sphinx that was fed a raw chicken diet from the breeders that went to the owner. And then it was found to be limping, and it had a hind limb fracture. And so it was eventually diagnosed with nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, and then plus or minus rickets. So as a quick overview and a quick reminder, typically this does occur. It's a physiological response to an abnormal diet. It's higher in phosphorus and lower in the calcium. So you've got the reverse of that calcium to phosphorus ratio. And it's mostly seen in these animals, like an all chicken meat diet, when there's no bones. And rickets is when you've got the vitamin D3 deficiency, and again it's more likely to occur in young animals. And it's quite difficult to differentiate rickets and secondary hyperparathyroidism, because clinically they tend to be clinically they'll present with the same symptoms. But once you move them over to a complete and balanced diet, hopefully then those clinical signs you repeat the x-rays, and that bone density will resolve. Other things that we've seen, and is actually reported in the literature by Dr. Lennox. She saw a kitten that had a taurine deficiency. As a reminder, taurine, that was on this cat that had the all chicken meat diet. Taurine is an essential amino acid. It's in cats, and it's essential because they lack certain enzymes to be able to produce it themselves. Taurine is essential for fetal, for growth, reproduction, vision, cardiac, and so forth. And so for this kitten, you'll see in that little photo on the left eye, there was she had a microophthalmia, so a small eye. But looking at the back of the retina, there was increase in blood vessels in the back of the eye, and so there was a central retinal degeneration, CRD, which is commonly associated with taurine deficiency. And not this cat per se, but cats that are fed taurine deficient diets can also show cardiomyopathy, so DCM, and that was seen in a Glasgow 2002 study. Which was this study here. There was other things that when we consider about raw diets is that they can be deficient in taurine, But what we don't understand in these diets as well is where taurine and interactions can occur and where it can be lost. Taurine may be adequate in the diet, but it could be lost if it's in the cooking process, if it can be lost during the water, it can be lost during storage, handling. If there's bacterial contamination, you'll get lower amounts of taurine as well. And same within the gut, it may be taken out in through the digestive tract. And if you're not feeding organ meat and just muscle meat, you'll have a lower amount of taurine. And then again, depending on life stage, kittens may require a higher amount than that of an adult. So these deficiencies may or may not be seen when feeding raw meat diets. Something that has come up, and I don't think we talk about very often, but if we're feeding raw diet and where actually dogs are consuming the thyroid of that animal, they can actually be seen to have hypothyroidism in dogs. So the T4 and the TSH can be elevated. And in this is one study that was done, these dogs were diagnosed with hyperparathyroidism. In human, it's called thyrotoxicosis. And so there's just to be aware that if the raw meat actually does contain the thyroid of the animal, then potentially they can be at risk of hyperparathyroidism. The biggest concern that you'll see in the literature, and more often than not, is the safety concerns. So when we talk about the dental health, we might say bones are to clean the molars. It's good for the mechanical abrasion on the tooth. But however, we do know that bones are highly risky, whether they're cooked or not. They can cause teeth fractures, which then can become infected. And if you were in the wild and you don't have a veterinarian to pull the tooth, chances are that can actually even be fatal. So that's something that's very different to our pets. So they're at risk of tooth fractures, GI perforations. You can have foreign bodies as well, very common. And I've worked in emergencies, so these things are very realistic. And if anything, I would encourage not to feed bones. They're also high in fat, and so there's also a risk of obesity as well. My general guidelines were not to feed bones and rather do teeth cleaning yourself with a finger brush or certain diets to achieve that, and is much, much safer. The study on the right-hand side showed with the cats that domestic cats have lower incidence than feral cats for dental calculus and periodontal disease. So just think about that too. Just because they have bones doesn't mean that they've got a decreased risk. And the other thing, more common and plenty of literature to show the risk of bacterial contamination. We see salmonella with the chicken. We see Campylobacter as well. There's Yersinia, E. coli, Listeria, and the list does go on. When we are concerned about parasites, there's toxoplasma, which is obviously there's a zoonotic risk as well. Neospora, roundsworm, tapeworms, and yes, the main risk for us are for the young and for the elderly and for immunocompromised people. So some of these microorganisms can be transferred to us through the fecal-oral route. And as much as you think the area is clean, it's quite hard to disinfect certain areas. So we are definitely at risk of that transfer. And if you are immunocompromised or even the animal is immunocompromised, there is obviously a risk of sepsis, which is fatal, can be fatal. Another point to highlight here for your owners too is raw food is not just the raw meat, but it can include pig's ears, cow hooves, bull penises, the bullies that are sold as treats, and just the raw hides that they just chew on, as you can easily access at pet food stores. So I've seen enough reports as well. There's enough in the literature too, and a lot of recalls on like pig's ears, raw hides that have been contaminated with salmonella. So also keep that in mind when you're advising owners feeding raw, because it includes this too. Food safety, I've pulled out as many as I could. These are just a prime example. The first one, actually, I would recommend to read this one above, which is a great overview done by Davies and relatively recent in 2019. And it goes through a summary of all the, a nice summary of all the literature that's been done and all the microorganisms that have been associated with the type of diet. But these are just some more examples. I can share the slides with you and you can have a read of these yourself. But as I said, there's enough literature to see that there is detection of salmonella and in many different types of raw diets, and contains a high risk. Something else that has come up, and I've recently reviewed 2 papers, is looking at antimicrobial resistance, which is a health concern. So even though we may not be consuming or we may not be contaminated immediately by E. coli or show signs or symptoms or hospitalised, where there's increased risk of antimicrobial resistance. And there's 2 studies that were done in Australia, and that was looking at antimicrobial resistance in urinary tract infections. And that was from dogs that was consuming raw meat diets. And so there was this transmission within the same household of the dog and the human. So we've got antimicrobial risk as well. This is an example. It's a good study as well, just to show you the difference between raw pet food. And what you can see with this is that there's a higher incidence of salmonella in raw food in comparison to the other formats of diets that have been tested. So out of 196 diets that were tested, 15 were positive for salmonella, and then another for the monos, I can't even pronounce it, cytogenes, salmonella as well. And whereas if you look at dry food, then these have been tested. There's no, it's not, salmonella has not actually been detected, nor has listeria. Oops, let me go back. Nor has listeria. So it's relatively, it's actually too high. Even with the dry extrusion and that the dry food canning process goes through, it's for a reason, because it's able to remove those bacterial contamination in that process. And so when we say during high temperature, during the extrusion process, is very technical. And to reassure the owners is that every nutrient has been taken into account, and the loss of nutrients during the process. So it's accommodated. So if the nutrients are lost, it will be added back in. So you still have complete and balanced diets through a dry extrusion process, and it's safe with no salmonella or microtoxins. Even as much as owners want to believe that cleaning the food bowl is just a way to eliminate the contamination from the salmonella or other bacterial species, the concern in this study showed here is that even with scrubbing and bleach, there is still up to 42%. There is still up to 42% contamination of the bowls even after disinfection. So it's actually quite hard to leave, to remove the contaminated material from those bowls. And you may put that with your own food bowls. You may put it with your children's food bowl. It may be on the table still where you're cooking, where you're preparing your own food. So it's actually a very high risk. And on the opposite side, the pet food company claims that they're using this high pressure processing system to ensure that that they're free from pathogenic bacteria. However, going through studies and looking through the process, high pressure processing it may reduce the numbers, it may slow down the number of bacteria, but it doesn't achieve a complete death or total sterilisation. So that's quite important to realise that. So, and ultimately, you can get the facts, and it's really good to also advise your owners and veterinarians as well, other veterinarians, to have a look at the FDA. So it's a great Food and Drug Administration website that'll give you advice on feeding raw diets. And if you do feed, what are some recommendations on how to clean, on how to feed your pet, how to thaw the diet. So that's also quite useful. Because at the same time, owners, if they're going to feed raw, we may not be able to change their mind. All we can do is give them the knowledge, give them the facts, try for them to be as responsible as they can be when handling the diet, and be aware of who's in their household and who's in their environment, and then let them choose themselves to make that decision. So this is a good example here where you can get a fact sheet and then responsible feeding of raw food. We don't encourage it, but again, you have to give them, if they're going to do it, they're highly likely to. So you can jump onto the FEDIF, which is the European Pet Food Guidelines, and you can give that fact sheet a handout to them. For yourself and for other veterinarians, I think these are very easy, useful reads. So a little bit older, but I think quite standard examples. And Timely Topics in Nutrition is a great resource to just have facts on general nutrition subjects, and it will go through the benefits and the cons of raw diets, and it will go through the different literature that is currently available. But there's more and more and more, and there's plenty on this topic to research as well. So you can definitely jump onto PubMed and have a look. Around the world, there's all different statements about feeding raw diets, which you can have a read here. I won't go through all of them, but like FDA doesn't believe in raw feeding diets. I think there's enough evidence, like if you look at the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association as well, I think there's enough concerns, public health risks that would, as they say, outweigh, which is a great word. There's more risks outweighing the benefits. As I said, the benefits are anecdotal for raw at this point in time. AAHA, they don't advocate it. There's all different terminologies, so you could probably even encourage vet owners to read this, and maybe it might change their minds as well, because it's a strong stance globally that the risks are really exceptionally quite high. And then owners, I like this website. It's a Nutrition Global Toolkit, which is excellent, and it helps you, but it also can help the owner make their own decision on how to pick a diet, whether that's canned diet, whether it's a raw diet, whether it's a home-cooked diet, but probably more so for commercialised products. I would really think about, because home-cooked raw diets can be formulated and said that they've gone through an AFCO trial, but what you would want to do is call that company and say, do you have a nutritionist on board? Like, how did they make a complete and balanced diet? Who was in that process of formulating the diet? How are they present in peer-reviewed journals? Are they active in research? Are they going to nutrition conferences? Think about those things as well. The AFCO feeding trials are important. Not always does just because a diet has it gone through an AFCO feeding trial mean it's the premium. It's an excellent resource. It's reliable, but it's also, you just need to think about, is a feeding trial necessary? You ideally would want it to be AFCO, not so much tested, but AFCO formulated for that particular life stage, and that it meets the nutrient requirements for that life stage and for that growth phase of that animal. But it doesn't need to go through a feeding trial per se, but just think about that as well. And especially quality control measures. How are they assuring that they have free salmonella, or that they're free of bacterial contamination? Where do they get their raw ingredients from? And if an animal is sick from their product, who is going to help you? Who's going to help the owner when the animal is sick in hospital? So they're things as well. And bigger companies like Royal Canin, if it is other pet food companies, the competitors as well, typically they're available to take your call, whereas maybe smaller boutique, companies cannot. So just think about when the animal does need help or you need help, who can you count on? And so that's overall. I think, again, you need to think about the pet health risks as well as human health risk when you're feeding raw, because there is a zoonotic concern, and especially for immunocompromised and young animals. If you have humans, if you have young children in the house, really think about those risks. I don't think you would intentionally want to feed or harm your family with bacterial, E. coli or Campylobacter, and cause health conditions that could potentially be lifelong. Think about the anecdotal versus proof. Go to the literature. The literature is there, and there is plenty. So again, those skin and coat, the teeth, the long immunity, longevity, it doesn't exist at this point in time. Maybe in the future, but we're not there. If it's just about fecal content, fecal production, high digestibility, there's plenty of highly digestible diets that are cooked as well. Understanding your client, this is in any when you're picking a diet, it's really important to understand the owner's motivation and try to respect that as best as you can. You can't change their mind, but you give them as much information and try to give them a diet that appeals to their daily lifestyles, their values, their opinions, and something that they're going to stick to, because if not, then they'll probably just stray from your recommendations. Make your nutritional assessment. Also assess, is a raw diet or a cooked, home-cooked diet, is it going to meet the animal's nutritional needs? Again, is it AFCO balanced? Is it right for their life stage? If they're growing, if they're lactating, if they're just at maintenance, make that assessment. Providing your recommendation, again, if they choose to feed raw, give them the safest recommendation possible and give them all the warning and all the consequences, the pros and cons, and let them make that decision and make it clear. Home-cooked diets as well, so if it is cooked and they decide from, going to a home-cooked diet, remember that you'll need a veterinary nutritionist advice. As you saw, it's very difficult to tailor a home-cooked diet and to meet all the nutritional requirements of all the macrominerals, microminerals, and all the vitamins. And ultimately, it's about the patient's health and welfare is what we're looking at the end of the day. So I'll leave that there, and I'm hoping that there's enough time for some questions and a quiz. I think there was a quiz.
Dr. Lara, thank you very much. Firstly, am I audible? Am I audible?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, awesome. So, Dr. Lara, I was saying that thank you very much for a very amazing presentation. I learned a lot within the space of 38 minutes in which you talked. I kind of learned about the different types of zoonotic diseases that you can get from raw diet, and I would kind of think to agree with you because salmonellosis is something that is very common and something that the animal can get from it. Regarding the quiz, so yes, we are planning to have a post-webinar quiz after this. Unfortunately, due to some reasons, we would kind of just send the Kahoot quiz link to them.
Okay.
So for the participants, we would send you a link, and you can just take the quiz. And at the end of the day, we would determine who the winner is. Moving on to the next thing, we're kind of going to take some question and answer session now. And I would want to invite Genesis, a member from my team. She's the social media manager for the Standing Committee on One Health. So she would be the one to moderate this part of the session. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Lara. It was very amazing listening to you, and I learned a lot.
That's a pleasure. I hope it was clear. There is a lot.
Yes, it was clear, and we understood everything clearly. Oh, well, I did. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Genesis, are you here?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's afternoon here in Nigeria.
Yeah, it's afternoon here in France too.
Oh, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lara. All right, I'll be anchoring the question and answer. Ebenezer asked if you can make the slide available.
Yes, there's nothing. There'll be some links available that I've put in there, say for the FDA. All the literature you can easily access. Or if you have trouble, I can try to send the actual article themselves. But as I mentioned as well, this is quite top line. I tried to pick most of the current literature, but there's a vast amount. But yes, most happy to send the slides.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, doctor.
That's a pleasure. I think one thing is just to, I think when I was learning about raw and when I was at the university in America, is that we didn't do raw food diets, and I think it's just common, and you'll probably come up against owners just believing that it is an ancestral thing, that they're really trying to feed the wolf, the inner wolf. I think people are concerned that the commercial pet food are not honest. I think they think that we're using, some roadkill, or that we're using chemicals within the production. And really another one is that there's a high heat, which I keep going back to, or that there's enzymes are destroyed. But all that the engineers in a pet food company, whether it's us or whoever you choose, or the owner chooses, that's factored into. So if there's vitamin losses or if there's mineral losses, that'll all come back into the product. So it will be complete and balanced. So that's something to reassure. But when it comes to that ancestral discussion about the wolf or about the leopard within the inner cat, we just don't see the way our pets are and the lifestyle that our pets are and how far separated they are from their ancestors is really important. And I think they didn't live long lives out in the wild. It was very harsh. They were very, I think there's more diseases that would come around from eating raw diets than what we actually feed our pets. So I think that's probably something as well. There's just no argument on that, if that helps you there. And there's a lot of options available. It doesn't have to be commercialized food as long as it's complete and balanced. So if you can seek a nutritionist, it's really beneficial. The nutritionist will either be in an American college or a European college. And if you need help on finding a nutritionist, we can also support you there.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Lara. And I wanted to ask, because I noticed during your presentation, you kind of like mentioned osteopenia, and
Yes.
you were trying to associate it with our raw diet. So I wanted to find out if there's really like any difference between osteopenia and osteoporosis, or if they are the same. And if there's a difference, then osteoporosis is also associated with raw diet as well. Thank you.
Osteoporosis, it'll be the loss of bone. So it can be, one reason can be from a dietary cause, but it can be hormonal. And I don't think we'll see them, it won't be as common in elderly, like humans. And when you're seeing a loss in like elderly women, you'd need to look at the diet and consider the diet history. So if it was a young animal and they were on a deficient diet for a long period of time, it'll be more likely that it's osteopenia associated through nutritional osteopenia. But if it was not that, then you would probably need to work that up further, and it could be associated even if it's loss through bone, through a bone tumor, or if there's metastasis or something along those lines, something metabolic that's causing the loss in the bone. If it's hypocalcemia or, metabolic disorder that could cause that, you would need to do a further workup. But looking at the diet history would give you an idea whether there was a loss in calcium or the calcium wasn't being absorbed. And I think that's where you'd have to start working it up from there. But just on an X-ray, it'd be very difficult to differentiate that. And it's the same with the rickets as well. Both of them will have the osteopenia, but you don't know what the actual cause is there. So you'd have to work that up further. And first of all, starting with the diet history, but looking at the animal and the patient and go from there.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Guys, do not hesitate to send in your questions, and we would answer them. So we'll just wait for a minute to see if anyone has any questions.
I think it also depends where you are. I think where I'm from in Australia, home raw diet is very common. It's very common to feed bones as well. I don't know why. I think it's maybe because people in the park are all talking to each other, and they do believe that feeding raw has the benefits. So I think it also does just depend where you are in the world, and everyone will have a different opinion, which is interesting. I don't know what people here on the line have heard or what people do think. So yeah, it is interesting. So it'll be, I think it's just trends as well where you are globally. But again, as I say, it's if you do feed raw, if you do choose, maybe you can get them to do, if they don't want to feed commercial, do a home cooked diet, but speak to a specialist and get it, have it balanced by a nutritionist to make sure they don't avoid. They can avoid, because it's when you think about human diets as well, it's for our pets, it's more of a challenge, or it's more likely that they could come up to a deficiency or a toxicity for that matter, because we give them the same diet often day in, day out. And with the human, our diets are very variable. We eat many different things over different weeks, over different months. So it's never the same. So we don't tend to have, it's less likely to see that deficiency. But in our pets, if we tend to feed that same diet on a regular basis, it's more likely the deficiency or toxicity can be seen. And it's also important for your owners to be aware that they may think they're feeding the right choice at the time because they don't see the deficiency or nutritional change immediately. It's like us as well. So they don't feel like they're doing any harm. It's nutrients take time to deplete out of the system as well. So that's something to think about too, just how long it takes to see a deficiency. It's quicker in young animals because they're so delicate, but in older animals, middle-aged animals, you may not see it. And owners may think, and this happens very often, I've seen this numerous times, where they're feeding commercial, they change onto raw, or they do their own home-cooked diet, chicken and some rice, and the signs go away, or they think the coat improves. But there are so many factors that could have caused that change, and it's probably just really a coincidental situation. The weather may have changed, the carpet may have changed, medication may have changed. It could be the fibre in the diet, that the feces improved. There are so many aspects that could actually change for the reason as to why it improved in that animal. So I think that, and that's not just with raw, that's in any diet. That can be with a grain, switching from grain to no grain. There are so many components to a clinical sign, and the reason why it could get better or get worse. So I think that's a difficult correlation there. So I think that's also something to be aware of too, that just because you change, clinical signs are better, it's raw is the best. So you just need to think about the nutrients that could have caused that change, or what was in the old diet that may have not been ideal for that individual pet. But anyway, I think we're coming up on time. So I would say if you have questions or you need nutritional advice, I'm happy to help as best as I can. But I hope this has been informative for you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Lara.
Pleasure. Well, have a nice afternoon. Is there anything I can help with?
Yes, there are questions for you. Kalisa said, thank you so much, Dr. Lara, for the amazing presentation. I'm Kalisa from Indonesia. I want to ask a question regarding the nutritional inadequacy. Is it possible to overcome nutritional deficiency by mixing raw food with commercial food?
I've heard that before as well. No, because you can have a dilution effect as well. Ideally, when we talk about a balanced diet, if the raw food is being fed and that's not complete and balanced, technically I would see that as a treat. And so we say as nutritionists, and tends to be globally, that a treat should be no more than 10% of the total calories per day. Otherwise, you increase the risk of an imbalance. It doesn't mean it's a deficiency. It just means it's less likely to be balanced for all the needs. You're diluting out a commercialized product that is complete and balanced, and you feed something that you don't know the nutritional adequacy. You mix those together and you're diluting out the nutrients. You may get more of one nutrient for that matter. You may be adding more phosphorus combined with that diet. So it's not always a deficiency. And I think in general, anything that is not complete and balanced, no more than 10% of the total calories. So if you need a cat to eat 250 calories per day, no more than 25% needs to come from an alternative source. And that tends to be quite a safeguard there. I hope that's clear. And I think owners try to think that's how they can balance a diet, and it doesn't work like that, sadly. I do need to go to another meeting at 2, or actually 3, sorry, I missed that. So I do have to disappear, but thank you again, and I really enjoyed all your questions and your time, so I hope to do this again for you.
Okay, Dr. Lara, thank you very much. And thank you very much for sparing us your time. And really, it was amazing listening to you. Yes, it's fine. I would ask the participants that if they have more questions, they can email me and I could just forward it to you. If that will be fine, and we could just answer them. I hope that's okay. Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr.
Okay,
Lara,
take care.
Do enjoy the rest
Have a
of
good
your
evening,
day.
good morning, good day,
Yeah.
good week.
You too.
See you. Bye.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Lara and Dr. Dora. So much just now. Okay, guys. Thank you very much for joining us today and listening to us. It was quite nice, and I hope you kind of like learned a thing or two from today's presentation. I will try to forward the presentation that Dr. Lara used today to your emails, and also regarding the post-webinar quiz, I would let you know via email. And you can just look out for my email in the next 2 days, and then with more instructions on how to take the quiz. To enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah, bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.
So regarding the recording, we will post it on YouTube so you could watch it again. Thank you.